Well, beyond the immediate diplomacy, the bigger question is what this conflict reveals about the limits of American power and strategy. I want to bring in now Stephen Walt. He's a professor of international affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. Stephen, it's good to have you with us. I know you recently published an article in Foreign Policy called "The United States Has Become a Rogue State. Here's What the Rest of the World Can Do About It." And in that you write, the United States is still very powerful, even if it is now pursuing policies that will weaken it over time. So with that in mind, how much does this war with Iran illustrate that point?
Well, I think more than anything else, the war with Iran reveals, first of all, the limits of American military power. We can blow lots of things up, but we can't necessarily dictate political outcomes. But second of all, it raises real doubts about the competence of the American foreign policy leadership right now. And American influence is based in part on others trusting our judgment, thinking that American officials know what they're doing. And this war looks like something that was ill-planned and has basically been improvised from the very beginning. That doesn't increase confidence in American judgment.
You mentioned the appearance of incompetency. You know, it was well noted by media around the world that the recent talks in Islamabad were comprised of an Iranian foreign minister with a PhD. The other members of the delegation were all seasoned veterans of government and security. On the other side, for the United States, you had the vice president, you had a real estate billionaire, and you had Trump's son-in-law. So are we seeing here structural limits of power, or are we seeing here just simple, poor decision-making?
Well, there's clearly the latter, that, this is amateur hour diplomacy, and it's not surprising that the talks before the war didn't go anywhere, and it's not surprising that the talks in Islamabad were a complete failure. You can't solve a problem like this in 24 hours with amateurs. But more importantly, the planning for the war itself was haphazard. No one seemed to take seriously the possibility that Iran might actually close the Strait of Hormuz, even though they'd been preparing to do that for a long time and saying that's what they would do if they were attacked. We just assumed, or the American leadership just assumed, that everything would go quickly, the regime would collapse, and the war would be over in a few days. And that's just bad planning.
Yeah, I mean, and it's more than just amateur hour here, right? You argue that the United States is now behaving like a rogue state. I mean, what does that mean in practice in a conflict like we're seeing right now with Iran?
Well, a rogue state traditionally is thought of, first of all, as a state that's a threat to international peace and security. And by starting this war, which affects countries all over the world for economic reasons, the United States has threatened all of their interests. We've also shown a remarkable indifference to international norms and international law. It's an illegal war. We've also assassinated the civilian leadership of Iran quite deliberately, thereby destroying a long-standing norm that governments didn't try to kill each other's leaders for all the practical reasons involved. So in a sense, the United States is acting like the kind of behavior we used to expect from countries like North Korea or Iraq or Libya under Gaddafi. And that can't be good for American influence over the longer term.
How do you think other countries view the United States at the moment?
I think the United States is now being viewed by others as impulsive and erratic and predatory. The impulsiveness is obvious, the way we keep shifting our goals, but the predatory part is really a shift in American foreign policy where we're not just trying to take advantage of adversaries, but we're also trying to take advantage of allies at every turn. And I think that's the other theme that allies around the world are starting to incorporate, that the United States is not predictable and often actually quite hostile to them.
These allies, are you talking about NATO members and the European Union, for example?
Absolutely, but not just those allies. I mean, first of all, the tariff policy that they've pursued deliberately attempts to harm other economies, force them to make concessions to the United States, something we have traditionally not done towards our allies. And second, when the administration says it wants to take over Greenland, something the president keeps repeating, even in the last couple of days, that's a sign of predation as well, of wanting to take things that don't belong to you.
Let me pull us back for just a moment to this war in Iran. There's a lot of focus right now on whether the United States can translate battlefield gains into a lasting political outcome. How hard is that in a case such as Iran?
I think that's extremely difficult. I mean, first of all, there's zero trust now between the United States and Iran. Iranians have no reason to believe any assurances we might make as part of a peace deal. We also have a more hardline Iranian regime, if that's imaginable. By killing off the top leadership, we've actually elevated to positions of prominence people who are more hardline. And lastly, we don't even know what the American objective is at this point. The stated war aims have shifted so many times in the last month that it's hard to know what a political settlement would look like from an American perspective. So I think getting anything positive out of this is going to be extremely difficult.
The announcements that have been coming out of the Pentagon, for example, have they been giving us news about tactical wins but strategic losses? I mean, to what extent is that risk driven by how this war has been managed rather than the underlying strategy itself?
Yeah, well, there's no question the United States was militarily superior to Iran, which is why we've been able to destroy so many things within Iran itself. Of course, that's produced more support for the government. Support was waning before the war. The population has tended to rally around it now, which is not what the United States necessarily wanted. But also, the ability to blow things up with impunity doesn't necessarily give you the ability to dictate, particularly when Iran had a way of retaliating. And it did exactly what it had threatened to do. It closed the Strait of Hormuz, imposed significant economic costs on the rest of the world. And at this point, there's little prospect that the strait's going to get open anytime soon. So the consequences and the costs are simply going to build up for all of us.
You know, in your article, Stephen, you lay out different strategies for dealing with the U.S. from balancing to de-risking. Which of those do you think countries are actually adopting in response to this war?
Well, the most obvious one, of course, is de-risking, which you see other countries trying to find new trade partners, trying to move away from fossil fuels, something the United States is not doing. Everyone is understanding what the implications of this are. We've also seen, countries like Spain and Italy distance themselves to some degree from the United States because they don't want to be associated with an impulsive and failed war. And finally, we're seeing countries, I think, looking now towards China as a more responsible player in world affairs, as a country that isn't constantly attacking others, isn't constantly disrupting the world economy in quite the same way. So one long-term consequence for this could actually be an improvement in China's political status to compensate for the loss of American influence.
If we step back for a moment, what does a genuinely successful outcome look like for the United States? And how often do wars like this, how often do they produce that kind of result?
When you make a big mistake, you usually end up paying a price for it. So the United States is not likely to come out of this in an improved position. As I said before, we're going to be dealing with a more hardline Iranian regime. We're going to be dealing with an Iran that will now have a greater incentive to try and pursue nuclear weapons, if not immediately, perhaps at some point down the road. And we're going to be dealing with allies around the world who see that the United States didn't take their interests into account when it decided to do this. In terms of a political outcome, the best thing I think the United States could do now is try to cut a deal, try to get the Strait of Hormuz open as rapidly as possible, and then try to repair relations with those countries who now have reason to question our judgment. But we're not going to come out of this with a clear win the way we might like.
I know that you have been quoted as saying that Donald Trump's USA is a predatory hegemon. You know as well as I do that Donald Trump will most likely be history after 2028. What could give hope that once he is gone, the benevolent hegemon USA will return?
Well, that's a great question. I think that it's going to be harder to rebuild trust in the United States, given that we elected Trump not once, but twice. But one of the things one can do is, first of all, stop listening to the people who got us here. And that involves some house cleaning in the American foreign policy establishment. And it also means holding the officials who were responsible for some of these errors accountable. If the rest of the world sees the United States actually, say, punishing former officials, not for policy disagreements, but in cases where they might have broken the law, for example, that's a sign that we realize that we screwed up, and therefore others might have more confidence that we'll learn from this mistake and do better in the future.
Even if Donald Trump is an anomaly, do you think our allies will be able to forgive and forget?
I think that in the past, at least, when the United States has elected new officials, our image in the world has tended to rebound. So the American image was pretty low at the end of the Bush presidency. It soared as soon as we elected Barack Obama. The same thing happened when Joe Biden was elected after Trump's first term. So I think there's some possibility of a recovery, particularly if an incoming administration says the right things and stops acting in such a predatory fashion. But it's going to be a little bit harder this time because other countries have to worry that the pendulum will keep swinging back and forth between various extremes. And that's just a reason for them to start hedging and start being less dependent, less reliant on American help.
Professor Stephen Walt, very good discussion. We appreciate you taking the time to put all of this into context for us and for offering a little bit of a silver lining as well. Thank you.
All right. Nice talking with you.